Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk about this topic of the solution to our problems. I'm going to try and make the case that the problem is obvious, but that the solution is not to give up on randomized trials, but instead to do them properly. I think that it's important with all of this to actually start with some basic principles around the limitations of observational studies for identifying causal effects of treatment on health outcomes rather than just associations. Observational studies obviously have some strengths, but I think they're limited in terms of detecting causal associations to large effects on outcomes that would otherwise be rare. So myopathy with statin therapy, by which I mean muscle symptoms that really are caused by the statin in a very rare proportion of individuals, about 1 per 10,000 per annum. They, though, are, as has been discussed, prone to a number of sources of confounding and bias. And I'm going to try to make the case that however smart your statistician, however big your database, however sophisticated your methodology, you can't rely on them to tell you what's real. So they may well yield associations that are precise in the statistical sense of having small random errors, but that are not necessarily causal. That is, they can be precisely wrong. Let's take a real example. So we've had, over the last 20 or 30 years, a large number of randomized controlled trials of cholesterol-lowering therapy using statins. And in the cholesterol treatment trials meta-analysis, taking the large trials, prospective meta-analysis prior to all of these results being published was set up to look at individual patient data with about 5 years of treatment, randomized to statin versus control, or more intensive statin versus less intensive, looking at the effects on cancer, because for those of you who were around at the time, prior to the statins, there were claims that lowering cholesterol could increase cancer, road traffic accidents, murder, and a number of other things. You laugh, but it's true. Well, it's true that it was claimed. So if we look at the randomized trials on cancer, you'll see a relative risk of 1.00, confidence interval 0.96 to 1.04. So precise, but in this case, precisely right. And then for a number of these trials, they've linked into the health record system. So here's a use of data that we've been talking about to look at long-term follow-up beyond the 5-year trial, out to 10, 15, even 20 years with the WASCOP study in Scotland. And there's no emerging effect on cancer with prolonged follow-up. So very reassuring data. In 2012, I would like to note that the previous slide was published in the Lancet in 2010. A claim was published in the New England Journal that statins reduced the risk of cancer based on an observational study, a fantastic observational study. It was the whole of the Danish population health record system, so it's comprehensive and therefore generalizable. Not. It used the most sophisticated statistical methods, some of which we heard about earlier around correcting with propensity score matching and various other matching. You will see that what it has found is about a 20% reduction in cancer, narrow confidence intervals, precise, but in this case, precisely wrong. They adjusted for everything they could think of, and it persisted. I just draw your attention to the association of statins causing cardiovascular disease. Now, the randomized trials of lowering cholesterol have demonstrated that that's not true. This isn't a publication of HRT from 20 years ago. This is now. with really all the methodology that's meant to work, getting the wrong answer. So the FDA had some comments on this whole area of real-world evidence in the New England Journal in December 2016. And they said the confluence of large data sets of uncertain quality and provenance, the facile analytic tools that can be used by non-experts, and I don't think they mean easy, I think they mean facile in the true meaning, and a shortage of researchers with adequate methodology savvy could result in poorly conceived study and analytic decisions that generate incorrect or unreliable conclusions. I think they've been too generous. I think that sophisticated experts using the best possible methodology can get the wrong answer too, as we see in the previous slide. So if we're interested in plausible, moderate, beneficial, or adverse effects of treatment on common health outcomes, we need randomized trials. So the question isn't a substitution, it's how do we get them? And if we have wide eligibility criteria, and particularly if we have a large number of different trials in different circumstances testing a particular question, then that can yield generalizability, and in particular applying relative risks observed in randomized trials to absolute risks of different outcomes from observational data can help to generalize to different circumstances. So how do we address this in terms of an appropriate solution? Well, I think the problem has been caused by increased regulation and related bureaucracy, with increased obstacles, delays, and costs for trials, which have been mentioned. And this, I think, has had the contrary effect of encouraging the misuse of so-called real-world observational evidence. It's also, I believe, distorted the research agenda and reduced creative collaborations between academia and industry increasingly concerned about ensuring that they play by the rules, which are incredibly difficult to interpret. We're seeing fewer new treatments developed by industry, despite the fact that there are a lot that could be developed because they cost so much, and fewer academic trials because we're being priced out of the market. And this undue focus on complying with rules rather than on innovation in the design and conduct of trials, or to use Rob's words, think about what you do rather than tick boxes. And in my view, the key obstacle to all of this, in fact, the cause of the problems, is the International Conference on Harmonisation. Who are they? How does one influence them? Well, they are a group of regulators and industry. Why no patients or academics involved? And I think they've generated a lack of evidence of competence, or should I say, evidence of a lack of competence. Proven failures of ICH-GCP, and then most recently, a proposed amendment that would have introduced contradictions with their own document. So what are the key issues? Well, they don't start at the basic scientific principles of what actually matters, again, as Rob pointed out. The system's not working even for the registration trials of new drugs for which this was set up. Unsustainable costs, wasteful practices, poor quality. Here's an example. The Fourier trial is reported to have cost about $1 billion. 28,000 patients with only 2 years of follow-up. Now, I would argue that part of the reason why it was so short was the cost was so high, the need to get the drug to market with this evidence would tend to result in poor practice of not allowing the effects to emerge. So it underestimated the benefits of long-term therapy with treatment. We know from the previous trials that there is some delay. And if you look at that trial, you'll see there's little effect during the first year and then bigger effect in the later years. And of course, you need time to demonstrate effects on mortality. There was not enough time. But observational studies are useful for assessing big effects. Here's one. This is not the kind of classic example of, say, smoking and lung cancer epidemic. This is the effect of ICH on the CRO industry. Big enough, I think, for observational data to demonstrate it's probably causal. And what we're seeing is a huge increase in cost of trials, but hey, a lot of money being made by a small number of people. Wasted, and this is to the detriment of the public in terms of not allowing large-scale trials in a whole range of different areas to produce reliable evidence. ICH was set up by the funders, by the regulators and by the industry in order to have a single rule across the world for registration of new drugs. But it's being applied more widely than was intended. In Europe, the European Union regulation, that is the law that's going to be applied to Europe on clinical trials of all drugs, requires compliance with ICH. So too does the Gates Foundation. For all of their trials, in their grant conditions, you must comply with ICH-GCP. Gates is funding clinical trials in developing countries, in resource-poor countries. Not only is that meaning that the trials that he and his foundation fund are costing much more, but he is funding the training of people in inappropriate methodology that is having an incredibly adverse effect on public health in those resource-poor countries. Finally, after 37 years since ICH was set up in 1990, they've recognized that they've done some harm. And they're now looking at the possibility of changing. They've initiated a detailed revision, but again, they're not involving patients, the public, or non-industry trialists. And I ask, why not? Why not? Who are they? I don't remember, if you remember SMERSH, some kind of shadowy criminal organization up in an eyrie in the Swiss Alps or some Alps. But that's how ICH is in my mind. Why no transparency? Why are they dominating the clinical trial way? Let's think of some of the examples. Safety monitoring that people spend all of their time in clinical trials doing. The requirement to record all AEs, not just serious AEs, in large-scale trials, even when you know from smaller-scale trials of appropriate size that there is no effect on many of these AEs. The requirement to record narratives for all the serious AEs. What happens to all this information? The demands for unblinded results for AEs during ongoing trials from regulators. For blinded line lists quarterly, despite it being pointed out these are uninterpretable. When one complains about this, people say, well, show us it's not needed. Well, I would argue that, in the evidence area, you have to show things are needed. The regulators should show us this is necessary. Annual reports that so long that the safety signals risk being lost. And this is not just my view, talking to regulators offline. They say we get swamped by information. And I believe the FDA has kind of put out a memo saying, stop, you're overwhelming us. The lack of logical basis for the regulatory rules relating to randomized trials. I mean, you couldn't make some of this stuff up. The concept of a SUSAR, the suspected unexpected serious adverse reaction. So you've got a randomized controlled trial. Someone says, I think that this serious adverse event may be due to the treatment. You then unblind it. If it's in the active group, you report it. If it's not in the active group, you don't report it unless you think it's due to the excipient. So you've got a controlled trial, and you tell the regulators what happens in only one group. I mean, it's bizarre. If there were a really big effect on a rare outcome, this might work, but we don't need randomized trials for that. What we need randomized trials are for moderate effects. And these can have a much bigger impact on public health and rare side effects. Here's a real example of a randomized trial of a 50-year-old drug, niacin. $1 billion a year of sales in the US until this trial. 30% increases in new-onset diabetes, about a 20% relative increase in infections that led to hospitalization, 40% increase in bleeding that led to hospitalization, serious. None of these excesses were identified by the regulatory SUSAR or SAE reporting in the study, or indeed by 50 years of pharmacovigilance. How many times do we have to demonstrate that this kind of observational approach doesn't work? Another example of ICH-GCP guidance on monitoring of collaborating sites, and I underlined some of the misunderstandings. Reported trial data need to be shown to be accurate, complete, and verifiable. A need for on-site monitoring both during and after the trial. And it's really important to understand that we're not actually trying to get reliable data. We're trying to get reliable results. And high-quality data is not the same thing as reliable result, and vice versa. But yet, huge amounts of money are being spent on compliance with this. Checking people's curriculum vitae, have they had GCP training? I have not had GCP training, thank God.
Wait a minute, you're over and you have to leave. You're not qualified to speak.
Yes. That may well be true, but not for that reason. Source data verification, regulatory documentation. Just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it. What we actually need are much more efficient monitoring, and this is the kind of thing that through City has been espoused by the FDA and is now being promulgated by other regulators, using statistical monitoring. Use the data to tell you whether there are problems. Look at deviations in those data from what you would anticipate. Focus your visits, if there have to be visits, on resolving those. And think about it as being mentoring and training so that you avoid problems rather than just picking up problems. So that we encourage rather than inhibit innovation in the conduct of randomized trials. There's a very limited value in most cases of all of these data checks. And again, randomization is one of the most extraordinary inventions of the 20th century. And our failure to recognize that is part of the problem. But also, it's not just randomized, it's a randomized control trial. And that allows an enormous power and indeed the ability to get away with error in data. We need to put greater reliance on this comparison with the randomly allocated control group. For example, actually missing data have little impact if it's unbiased with respect to the allocated group. Here's some made-up data. So let's say the truth is that a treatment reduces the risk of an outcome by 20%, and I've got a 20,000 person study. It's occurring in 10% in the control group, 8% in the treated group. An odds ratio, which is pretty much similar to a relative risk, not quite, of 0.78, massively significant. If I miss 10% or 20% of those events, I get the same answer. So all of this checking to see whether stuff has been missed, not going to change the result. What about all the adjudication? I mean, anybody who's been involved in clinical trials, you get a whole lot of experts, and get them in a room, and then they look at all the clinical notes related to an outcome, and they spend hours, and you're trying to work out, well, is it a heart attack? Isn't it a heart attack? It's a waste of time. Here, let's have some extra false events. So these are evenly distributed because they're not actually the real outcome that is changed by 20% reduction. Add on 10%, add on 20%. I still get the same answer. The odds ratio pretty much unchanged. The statistical significance unchanged. You'll say, hey, this is me just kind of making up data. This isn't real data. So here's some real data. The heart protection study. Just as a kind of aside on cost, this study, 20,000 patients, 5 years, $20 million, 1/50th of the cost of the Fourier study. So here's the results for major vascular events, a 23% reduction in major vascular events per 1 millimole reduction in LDL cholesterol with simvastatin. And then you can see the different kinds of events, coronary events, strokes, revascularizations. This is actually what was reported from the sites, the unadjudicated data, the dirty data. This is what happened after adjudicating tens of thousands of events. Spot the difference. This represents a huge amount of work, a huge amount of cost for no purpose, and then it's checked by the regulators. So this is my embarrassing slide in the sense that, we ought to know this, but I'm going to say it anyway. What are the strengths of randomized trials? Randomization. Provides groups of patients that differ only randomly from each other in terms of risks of events. You cannot say that. You cannot know that. You cannot rely on that with observational studies, however big your computer, however clever your statisticians, however sophisticated your technology. So that the differences in outcome can be inferred to be causal. Blinded control, not always necessary, but for subjective outcomes, it can ensure that you have comparable ascertainment in the different treatment groups. So differences in event identification are applied equally. They can be applied equally badly, but that still allows you to detect differences. And there's a whole lot of nonsense about, randomized trials can only pick up efficacy because they weren't designed to pick up the side effects. As you saw with the Thrive example, and again, just to compare that with Fourier, 1/10 of the cost of the Fourier trial, despite being 5 years rather than 2 years, same number of patients. That showed that you can pick up unexpected adverse effects in these large trials. Blinded control ensuring that you do things equally badly in both groups. And the problem with observational studies is obvious. You can't blind them. So the people who are taking a treatment know they're taking it, mostly. And so they may well falsely attribute health outcomes to it, particularly if the data sheet says, as they often do, this data sheet will cause, we've all had our conversations with our mothers about, this data sheet says I'm going to be constipated and have diarrhea. I don't understand this. And so, of course they're going to report it more commonly. And as I've shown earlier, I think other biases render them unreliable in the sense of, my definition, you cannot rely on them. They may get the right answer, they may get the wrong answer, but you can't tell. So in conclusion, we've got a really serious problem. I would like to argue that, observational data has its place, but the solution to this particular problem is not to throw out randomized controlled trials, but to throw out the rules that are currently impeding randomized trials. We need to develop evidence-based, principle-based strategies for randomized trial and not instead increase inappropriate reliance on non-randomized observational data. Over dinner last night, Rob said to me, you should, write a guidance on that. And I said, the key thing is you need a guidance on the principles. He said, write that. So overnight I did. In 1984. Thank you very much.